Hi, Dr. Yass here. I want to talk about the issue of the symptoms you're experiencing and what exactly is creating those symptoms. Let's say that you're having pain or an altered sensation at a particular area. I don't think people truly recognize the core principle originally to understand is that pain is an indication of a tissue in distress. The tissue that is in distress is the tissue that is eliciting the symptom. That is the thing that I don't think people truly understand. The symptom is not simply being released by the body as a whole. The purpose of the pain or altered sensation is to create conscious awareness, to make you aware that a tissue is in distress. It's not working properly. The idea of eliciting a symptom is part of the body's defense mechanism. It's the quickest way to create awareness that something isn't working correctly. That is why the body has developed this mechanism to have the tissue, when in distress, release some sort of symptom. That's why you get symptoms. So, if, for instance, your heart is in distress, the heart will elicit pain at the chest and the left arm. The heart does not elicit pain anywhere else in the body because the body has designed the mechanism that the heart elicit pain typically just in this one location, so that there can be developed a relationship between the symptom and the tissue that is eliciting the symptom. So when you think of left chest pain and left arm pain, you think of the heart and you're having a heart attack. If you're having a kidney stone, the kidney will elicit pain in the lower back. If you're having pneumonia, you'll have pain in the upper back. What is critical to understand is that it is actually the tissue in distress that is eliciting the symptoms. So in this case, it's the lung that's in distress, eliciting the pain at the upper back. The same concept holds true whether you're talking about the neck, the back, or the extremities. The tissues that we typically look at as to which can possibly create a symptom in those areas typically relates to bone, muscle, or nerve. What you must appreciate is that each one of those tissues will create a very specific symptom. And in understanding which tissue is creating which symptom helps to allow you to understand exactly what tissue is in distress and therefore what tissue needs to be treated. Now, what you need to recognize is the fact that if a muscle is in distress, the medical establishment has not been educated or trained to identify these types of causes. Right now, the existing model, I think pretty much everybody who's been in pain, who has sought medical attention, will acknowledge is that the primary mechanism for identifying the cause of pain is the MRI. The MRI will identify structural variations that happen to exist in the area where the pain or altered sensation is being experienced, but the reality is that those structural variations are independent to the actual tissue eliciting the symptom. We can know this for sure because of the fact that, number one, if we're talking about a herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, a meniscal tear, a compression fracture, pretty much any of these structural variations that are identified, these are progressive in nature. They take a very long time to develop. In fact, they take years, if not decades. Now, the way the system works is that you get your first MRI at the time you're having pain. So the identification of the structural variation is achieved only at the time you're having the pain. So The assertion that the structural variation is the cause of the pain is only developed because the identification of the structural variation is occurring at the time that the symptom is being experienced. My position or my suggestion to you is, imagine if an MRI was taken even a year before you had pain. What do you think the result of that MRI would be? The answer is exactly the same as what was identified at the time you were having pain. So, if you were to know that you had a structural variation, let's say a herniated disc, or stenosis or arthritis, and it had existed for a year prior to you having pain, and then someone suggests that it's the cause of your pain, you would certainly say that that seems hard to accept, because if I've had it for a year and it hasn't elicited pain, what would make it suddenly elicit pain? But the fact that the MRI is only performed at the time you're having pain kind of creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. If you know that roughly 90% of the population have structural variations, regardless of whether you have pain or don't have pain, regardless of whether you're right-handed or left-handed, regardless of whether you're 5 foot or 6 foot, everybody has these as a result of a degenerative process that's occurring. If you knew that that was there, then certainly, regardless of whether you take it when you're in pain or out of pain, doesn't matter. You're going to find a structural variation. What I need you to understand is that when you apply the premise that the symptoms being experienced are literally being elicited by the tissue in distress, you would actually see, and this is what I've experienced over 25 years treating more than 15,000 people, the symptoms being experienced could never have been created by the structural variations identified. Based on the physical presentation of the symptoms that the individual was experiencing, the structural variation could never have created those symptoms. I think that's the thing that probably enrages me most about the failure and ineptness of the system. I have treated so many people who were scheduled for hip or knee replacements, scheduled for back or neck surgery, because of the fact that they were told their symptoms were coming from a structural variation and that the only intervention that could be performed was surgery after everything else failed, the usual catch-all. When examining the individual, I was able to determine through the interpretation of the symptoms, which you would have to believe and accept is the most viable way of establishing what tissue is in distress, because it is that tissue that is eliciting the symptoms. I was able to figure out and establish that the tissue that was creating the symptom was not the structural variation identified. Now, let's say that a muscle was in distress. Why would a muscle be in distress? Because of the fact that you live in a gravity environment, which means forces being applied to you at all times, and when you try to perform any activity other than laying flat on the floor, certain muscles are going to be required to create force against gravity. And if all the muscles required to create that force are not strong enough, they will elicit a pain. They will strain and elicit pain. Or they might refer a pain. Or they might alter the position of the joint surfaces that make up your joints and cause joint pain. Or they might strain and impinge on a nerve that then refers a symptom. I have found in 95 to 98% of cases that is the cause of your symptoms. But you see, muscular deficits do not show up on diagnostic tests. This is the part I think that's hardest for most people to accept. There is no medical specialty that is educated or trained to identify muscular causes. So, if you can't find a specialist who can identify it, and diagnostic tests cannot identify it, there is a very high probability that the cause of your symptoms, which happens to be muscular, will not be able to be identified. That is why when a structural variation is treated, even through surgery, and you still continue to have the same symptoms, by definition, doesn't that mean that the wrong tissue must have been treated? Because when the right tissue is treated, the tissue that is eliciting the symptoms, and the distress of that tissue is removed, that tissue is no longer in distress. Therefore, it no longer needs to elicit the emergency protective mechanism of pain or altered sensation that has been elicited to make you aware of the distress. So if you're seeking medical attention and you continue to get treatments, procedures, surgeries, and you're still having the same symptoms, you must come to the realization that the wrong tissue is being treated. And that, in fact, the people that you're going to are simply incapable. Doesn't make them bad people. Might be the nicest people in the world. But the reality is that they are educated and trained in a way that prevents them from being able to properly accomplish the goal of establishing what tissue is in distress. What makes the Yost Method so unique, singular in its ability, is the fact that it is the only method that utilizes the interpretation of the symptoms that are being experienced to identify the tissue in distress. Quite simply, if you're getting treated and the symptom itself is what's being treated through medications, epidural nerve blocks, cortisone shots, radiofrequency ablation, rhizotomy, regardless of it, if the symptom is being treated, that is an equation for terminal chronic pain, because you're never reaching the cause. The only way to resolve pain is through identifying the tissue in distress that's eliciting the symptoms, resolve the distress of that tissue, thereby ending the need for the tissue to elicit the symptoms. The Yass Method is the only method that has the capacity to identify the tissue in distress through the interpretation of the symptoms. In 95 to 98% of cases, it is muscle. Try to recognize there must be a theoretical basis why so many people are having pain now. The Yass Method is the only method that has a theoretical basis, and that is that you work against gravity. Muscles have to create an opposing force. If they're not strong enough, you will get a breakdown, you will elicit symptoms. And it could be, in fact, even if you're having a neurological symptom, it is not neuropathy, it is not radiculopathy. Those are just phrases, meaningless phrases. What's more apt to be the case is that you've strained a muscle, and the muscle has now thickened and impinged on a nerve that happens to be passing close to that muscle. In fact, that is what sciatica is. Sciatica is the result of the piriformis muscle in the gluteal region impinging on the sciatic nerve as a result of weakness of a muscle that is responsible for giving you stability and balance with weight bearing, called the gluteus medius muscle. There are other situations where this can occur. So, I want you to begin to understand that although there is this vast medical system, just because it exists does not mean that it is viable. It has existed based on this premise of the MRI being the mechanism for 30 years, and look at where everything stands. 130 million people in the United States suffering from chronic pain, 1 billion people in the world, 22 million people addicted to prescription pain medication in the United States. We have the medical establishment constantly creating new diagnoses to justify the fact that people are having symptoms and they can't identify the true cause. You need to get the Yost Method. That is your only true chance for resolving your pain. To get it, contact me at www.mitchellyost.com. You can see some information there. You can contact me through email at drmitch@mitchellyost.com, drmitch@mitchellyass.com. You can even call me on my phone, 516-449-1359. You just need to get the Yost Method and get your symptoms resolved. For now, this is Dr. Mitchell Yass wishing you a pain-free, fully functional life. Bye-bye.